10 minutes wasn't nearly enough time to wash away centuries, but Danu did her best. The mud vanished from her clothes with a thought, and her dark hair arranged itself into a simple braid that made her look more like an off-duty schoolteacher than what she actually was, which, depending on who you asked, might be described as a goddess, a force of nature, or simply a very, very patient landlady. She found her visitors seated in the snug, the pub's smallest and most private room. The space had a habit of expanding or contracting to fit its occupants' needs, and today it felt close and intimate, with dark wooden panels that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The peat fire in the corner burned with an oddly blue flame, responding to the power in the room. The old man rose when she entered. He was tall and thin, with wispy white hair and wire-rimmed glasses that might have been fashionable when Victoria was on the throne. His tweed jacket had leather patches on the elbows and smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old books. But it was his eyes that caught Danu's attention. They were the pale grey of Irish mist, and they had seen far too much. The young woman remained seated, her attention fixed on the untouched glass of whiskey before her. She couldn't have been more than 20, dressed in the international uniform of youth, ripped jeans, a vintage band t-shirt, and scuffed Doc Martens. A laptop bag leaned against her chair, covered in pins and patches that ranged from programming jokes to ancient Celtic symbols. Her hair was dyed a shade of purple that reminded Danu of twilight in the fairy realms. "Professor O'Brien," Danu said, extending her hand to the old man. "I believe we met once before, at Trinity College. You were giving a lecture on the intersection of Irish mythology and quantum mechanics. Most entertaining, especially the parts you got right." The professor's handshake was firm, but his smile was shaky. "You remember. I wasn't sure you would. That was 30 years ago, and you haven't aged a day." 30 years is nothing," Danu said, taking her seat. "I remember when your great-grandmother used to leave milk out for the good people. She had the sight, that one. Like you do." The young woman's head snapped up at this, her green eyes widening. They were remarkable eyes, Danu noticed, the exact color of spring leaves in morning sunlight. "Sarah," the professor said gently, "this is, well, she has many names. But today she goes by Danu. Like the goddess?" Sarah's voice was skeptical, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or fear. "Exactly like the goddess," Danu smiled. "Now, why don't you tell me what's brought a respected professor of theoretical physics and his—" She paused, studying Sarah more carefully, "his granddaughter to my pub on this wet Wednesday afternoon?" "It's about the changes," Professor O'Brien said, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "The ones your kind have been noticing. But it's more than just artificial intelligence and genetic engineering now. Something's happening at the quantum level. The boundaries between realities are becoming permeable." "They've always been permeable," Danu pointed out. "That's why this pub exists in multiple places at once. It's why the good people can still cross over on the old holy days." "This is different," Sarah spoke up suddenly. Her hand went to her laptop bag, clutching it protectively. "I can show you. I wrote a program. I didn't know what I was seeing at first. I thought it was a bug in the quantum computing simulation I was running for my thesis. But then things started happening. My code began writing itself. And the results." She swallowed hard. "The results showed patterns. Ancient patterns. Like the ones in Granddad's books, but expressed in mathematics." Danu leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "Show me." Sarah pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The screen filled with cascading lines of code, interwoven with geometric patterns that seemed to move of their own accord. To most observers, it would have looked like an elaborate screensaver. But to Danu's eyes, it was something else entirely. It was a map. A map of the places between places, the quantum foam where reality bubbled and sparked. And there, in the mathematical equivalent of red ink, were the tears. Hundreds of them. Growing larger every day. Well, Danu said softly, that explains the summons. She looked at Professor O'Brien. How long? At the current rate of degradation? 6 months. Maybe less. His voice was heavy with exhaustion. The walls between worlds are coming down, Danu. And when they do? When they do, Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger now, everything changes. Not just our world, but all of them. The simulations show a total collapse of quantum coherence across multiple dimensions. Reality itself will become unstable. Danu sat back, absently noting that her whiskey glass had refilled itself. The fire in the corner had turned a deep, troubled purple. And why? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Have you brought this to me instead of taking it to the authorities? Or to the other scientists who must be noticing these anomalies? Professor O'Brien and Sarah exchanged a look. It was the young woman who answered. Because last night, I dreamed of you. I saw this pub, and you, and... She hesitated. And I saw what I really am. What I could be, if someone taught me. Danu studied her more carefully now, looking past the surface to the threads of power that wound through Sarah's being. They were there, unmistakable now that she was looking for them, lines of force that hummed with the same frequency as the old songs, the ones that had shaped the world. Ah, Danu said. Now I understand why they're calling us home. They're not trying to protect us from the humans. They're trying to protect us from you. From me? Sarah looked startled. Not you specifically, dear. From what you represent. A bridge between worlds, science and magic, human and divine. The old powers don't like bridges. They prefer clear boundaries, ancient rules. Danu smiled, and for a moment, her face held all the wild beauty of Ireland's hills and all the depth of its most ancient seas. Fortunately for you, I've never much cared for rules. The professor slumped in relief, but Sarah sat straighter, her eyes bright with questions and possibilities. Does this mean you'll help us? She asked. Help you? Oh, no. Danu's smile widened. I'm going to teach you. And then, my dear, we're going to change everything. Outside, the rain had stopped. The AI surveillance system noted this meteorological event, but failed entirely to notice the rainbow that appeared over the Wandering Hart, a rainbow that shimmered with colors no human eye had ever seen, and which curved not up into the sky, but sideways, disappearing into somewhere else entirely, last edited just now. First lesson, Danu said, leading Sarah and Professor O'Brien down a spiral staircase that definitely hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Reality is largely a matter of consensus. Right now, most humans agree that magical staircases can't appear out of nowhere in Dublin pubs. This makes our work both easier and harder. Schrodinger's staircase, Sarah murmured, running her hand along the ancient stone wall. It both exists and doesn't exist until someone observes it. But who's doing the observing? And which observer matters? Exactly the right questions, Danu approved. Your grandfather's work on quantum consciousness wasn't as far off as his colleagues thought. Though I suspect even he didn't realize just how right he was. Professor O'Brien coughed modestly. I had some help. That summer I spent in Tibet wasn't entirely devoted to theoretical physics. The staircase opened into a vast circular chamber that, by all rights, should have occupied the same space as several popular tourist shops above. The walls were lined with books, scrolls, and items that defied easy categorization. A glass case held what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary smartphone, except that its screen showed real-time images from inside dreams. Next to it sat a clay tablet covered in cuneiform that updated itself like a Twitter feed, showing the thoughts of long-dead Sumerian priests. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, its surface inlaid with complex geometric patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. Sarah's laptop, which she'd brought down with them, began to hum as soon as she set it on the table. Your code, Danu said, is essentially a new form of poetry. The ancient bards used words to reshape reality. You're using mathematics. Different language, same principle. She gestured at the table. Show me again what you found. Sarah opened her laptop, but before she could start typing, the code began writing itself across the screen. The geometric patterns lifted off the display like a hologram, interacting with the designs on the table beneath. Where they touched, tiny sparks of possibility flew up like fireflies. Oh, Sarah breathed. It's singing. You can hear it? Professor O'Brien asked sharply. Not with my ears, Sarah said. But it's there. Like the way you can feel a bass line in your chest at a concert. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, not typing but conducting, and the patterns changed. Each quantum state has its own frequency. Its own note in the song. And the tears? Danu prompted. Sarah's expression grew troubled. They're like discords. Wrong notes. Places where the song is breaking down. She looked up at Danu. But why? What's causing it? Too much chaos, Professor O'Brien suggested. Too many observers changing the quantum state of things with our instruments and experiments. No, Danu said. Too much order. Your AI systems, your quantum computers, they're trying to impose rigid mathematical laws on a universe that needs its poetry. Reality isn't just particles and waves. It's stories. Dreams. Possibilities. When you try to pin it down too precisely, it tears. Like trying to debug code by removing all the random number generators, Sarah said suddenly. You think you're making it more predictable, but instead, the whole system crashes, Professor O'Brien finished. Because sometimes you need that element of chaos to make things work properly. Exactly. Danu waved her hand, and a tea set materialized on a previously unnoticed side table. Which is why the old power solution won't work. They want to separate science and magic completely, restore the natural order. But there is no natural order. There never was. There's just the story, constantly being retold. She poured tea into delicate cups that might have been Ming Dynasty porcelain or might have been created seconds ago from pure mathematics. And right now, we need a new version of that story. One that can reconcile quantum mechanics with quantum poetics. Sarah took her teacup, staring into its depths. The liquid inside wasn't any color found in nature, but somehow it looked exactly like what tea should be. Is that why I can do what I do? Because I'm part of the new story. You're not part of it, Danu corrected. You're writing it. With every line of code, every equation, you're creating new patterns in the quantum foam. New possibilities. She smiled. The old powers are afraid because they think you'll write them out of existence. They don't understand that a good story needs all its characters. Professor O'Brien set his cup down with a sharp click. But the tears are still spreading. Even if Sarah is meant to help bridge the gap between science and magic, how do we stop reality from unraveling while she learns? Before Danu could answer, a bell began to toll somewhere above them. Not the cheery pub bell that called for last orders, but something deeper, older. Something that made the air itself shiver with recognition. Sarah's laptop screen went black, then filled with scrolling symbols that weren't any known programming language. The geometric patterns above the table began to spin faster, throwing off sparks of possibility like a Catherine wheel. Ah, Danu said, setting down her teacup. It seems we're about to have more visitors. The old powers have noticed what we're doing here. She looked at Sarah. Ready for lesson 2? What's lesson 2? Breaking rules, Danu grinned. Lots of them. The bell tolled again, and this time the sound carried voices, ancient, powerful voices that spoke of stone circles and star maps, of ley lines and lab results, of stories that had been old when the world was young. Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The code on her screen was still writing itself, but now it seemed to be waiting for something. For her. Remember, Danu said softly, it's all about consensus reality. They'll try to impose their version. Your job is to suggest alternatives. Politely, of course. We're not barbarians. And what will you be doing? Professor O'Brien asked. Oh, Danu's smile had a wild edge now, I'll be running interference. I've gotten quite good at it over the millennia. She looked up at the ceiling, where the bell's vibrations were making reality itself ripple like a disturbed pond. Though I have to say, this is the first time I've had to explain to the ancient powers of Earth and Sky why they need to update their protocols to handle quantum encryption. The bell tolled a third time, and the walls of the chamber began to fade, revealing spaces between spaces, possibilities between possibilities. Sarah's code sang louder, harmonizing with the bell's deep note, offering new patterns, new pathways, new ways for old stories to remain true while still making room for the new. Professor O'Brien grabbed his granddaughter's hand. Sarah, are you sure about this? We could still. No, Sarah said, and her voice held echoes of both binary code and bardic verse. This is exactly where I need to be. Her fingers began to dance across the keyboard, weaving mathematics and mythology into something entirely new. Besides, she added with a grin that matched Danu's, I've always wanted to debug the universe. Above them, the voices in the bell's toll grew louder, more insistent. But now they had to compete with a new sound, the sound of reality being carefully, lovingly, expertly reprogrammed, one quantum poetic line at a time. The second lesson was about to begin. They arrived like thunder, not with sound, but with the memory of it. The air crackled with potential energy, and reality bent around 5 figures who now stood in the chamber. They wore shapes that human minds could process, but these forms were merely courteous translations of their true nature. The first appeared as a woman carved from basalt, her hair a cascade of molten rock that somehow didn't burn the ancient wooden floor. The second shimmered like a heat mirage, barely holding human form at all. The third and fourth were twins, one seemingly made of morning mist, the other of evening shadow. The fifth, their leader, looked deceptively ordinary, an elderly woman in a green dress who might have been someone's grandmother, if your grandmother had galaxies spinning in her eyes. Danu, the leader said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's laptop speakers hum in sympathy. You've gone too far this time. Good evening, Mother, Danu replied cheerfully. Would you like some tea? It's a quantum blend, exists in multiple delicious states simultaneously. This is not a time for jokes, the basalt woman rumbled. The barriers are failing. The human girl's code is accelerating the collapse. It must be stopped. Sarah's fingers hadn't ceased their dance across the keyboard, though she spared a glance at the new arrivals. Actually, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was, I'm not accelerating anything. I'm documenting it. There's a difference. The heat mirage flickered closer to her screen. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through desert canyons. Your equations, they mirror the old songs. The ones we use to shape reality. But they're unstable. Unpredictable. Like quantum mechanics itself, Professor O'Brien interjected. He had moved to stand behind his granddaughter's chair, one hand on her shoulder. The uncertainty isn't a bug, it's a feature. The misty twin drifted forward. We have maintained the balance for millennia. Science in its sphere, magic in ours. The boundaries must be preserved. The boundaries, Danu said, are artificial. And they're killing us all. She gestured at Sarah's screen, where the code had begun to form patterns that looked remarkably like Celtic knotwork. Look at what she's doing. Really look. The shadowy twin moved to peer at the display. She's not breaking the barriers at all. She's translating them. Finally, Danu sighed. Someone's paying attention. Sarah, would you like to explain what you're actually doing? Sarah nodded, her fingers still typing. Every quantum state is like a word in a story. But instead of just recording the story, my code is learning to tell it. Look here. She highlighted a section of scrolling symbols. This isn't a tear in reality. It's more like a metaphor. A way for different versions of the truth to coexist. The elderly woman, who was so much more than elderly or a woman, stepped closer. The galaxies in her eyes wheeled and spun. Show me. Sarah took a deep breath and pressed enter. The geometric patterns floating above the table suddenly expanded, filling the chamber with a web of light and mathematics. But instead of the chaotic tangle they'd been seeing in the tiers, this was a structured lattice of infinite possibility. Each intersection point glowed with both equations and ancient runes, quantum states and bardic verses, ones and zeros dancing with the elemental forces of creation. It's a translation layer, Sarah explained, her voice gaining confidence. Like how a computer can turn binary code into pictures or music. I'm not breaking down the barriers between science and magic, I'm showing how they're different expressions of the same underlying pattern. The basalt woman's molten hair flowed more slowly as she studied the display. But the tears are happening because we've been treating them as separate systems, Professor O'Brien said. When they're really different interface paradigms for the same universal API, Sarah finished. The heat mirage sparkled in what might have been amusement. She even speaks like a modern oracle. The question, Danu said, addressing the elderly woman directly, isn't whether to allow this integration, mother. It's already happening. The question is whether we help guide it or let it happen chaotically. The leader was silent for a long moment, galaxies wheeling in her ancient eyes. Finally, she spoke, show me how it works. All of it. Sarah looked at Danu, who nodded encouragingly. Well, Sarah began, pulling up a new window on her laptop, it started when I was trying to model quantum entanglement. But instead of using traditional state vectors, I represented them as narrative probabilities. The next hour passed in a blur of technical explanations and magical demonstrations. Sarah's code sang in harmony with the ancient power's own music. The Misty Twin contributed suggestions for modeling nonlinear time phenomena. The heat mirage helped optimize her quantum poetic algorithms. Even the basalt woman unbent enough to share some insights about crystalline computational structures. Professor O'Brien watched it all with proud amazement, taking notes in a journal that hadn't existed until he needed it. Danu kept the tea flowing, each cup containing a liquid that tasted like the first sip of morning sunlight. Finally, the elderly woman held up a hand. The galaxies in her eyes had resolved into a new configuration. Enough, she said. I begin to understand. This is not a breaking of barriers, but a recognition of patterns that were always there. She fixed Sarah with a stern look. But power such as this requires training. Structure. Wisdom. That's why I brought her here, Danu said. She needs teachers who understand both sides of the equation. The leader nodded slowly. The old powers will need to be convinced. The protocols rewritten. The very story of reality updated to accommodate this new understanding. I can help with that, Sarah offered. I'm pretty good at documentation. The shadowy twin laughed, a sound like starlight on water. She doesn't lack for confidence, this one. Good, said the elderly woman. She'll need it. She turned to Danu. You may proceed with her training. But we will be watching. And helping, when needed. And the tears? Professor O'Brien asked. Look at your granddaughter's screen, the basalt woman rumbled. They all turned to see Sarah's code flowing across the display. But now it wasn't just documenting the tears in reality, it was offering patches, updates, hot fixes that bridged the gaps between quantum mechanics and quantum poetics. Each patch was a tiny story, a piece of poetry expressed in mathematics, a bit of science wrapped in song. It'll take time, Sarah said. But the patches are holding. And each one teaches the system how to generate its own fixes. Reality, Danu said with evident satisfaction, debugging itself. The elderly woman's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Perhaps it's time we all updated our definitions of what's possible. She turned to go, the other ancient powers gathering around her. But she paused, looking back at Sarah. Oh, and child. Yes. Do try to maintain proper version control. We don't want any unauthorized forks of reality. With that, they were gone, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and a few new theorems scribbled in Sarah's code comments. Well, Danu said brightly, that went better than expected. Who's ready for lesson 3? What's lesson 3? Sarah asked, saving her work with the careful habits of someone who had lost code before. Quantum poetic optimization, Danu said. Or as we used to call it, teaching the universe to write better metaphors. She grinned. But first, I think we all need another cup of tea. Creating new paradigms of reality is thirsty work. Above them, in the pub proper, Sean was polishing glasses and pretending not to notice how the laws of physics had been slightly but significantly improved in the past hour. The AI surveillance system had given up completely and was taking a well-deserved break by watching cat videos. And reality itself, ever so slowly, was learning to tell new stories about itself. The next chapter was about to begin. Quantum poetic optimization, Danu said, drawing a complex diagram in mid-air with her teaspoon, is all about efficiency. Anyone can write a spell or an equation that works. The art is in making it elegant. The diagram hung between them, glowing softly. To Professor O'Brien, it looked like a cross between a quantum circuit diagram and an illuminated manuscript. To Sarah, it looked like the most beautiful code she'd ever seen. Watch this, Danu continued. She reached out and plucked one of the glowing lines, twisting it slightly. The entire pattern shifted, becoming somehow more right. Like a poem finding its perfect final word, or a program running in O1 time instead of O-N. That's amazing, Sarah breathed. You changed the underlying quantum state without disrupting the emergent narrative properties. How did you? She stopped as her laptop chimed. A new window had opened, displaying lines of code she hadn't written. But they weren't random, they were an exact translation of what Danu had just done. Your compiler's learning, Danu said approvingly. It's starting to recognize the patterns on its own. Try modifying that section there, the one that looks like a Celtic knot but is actually describing quantum superposition. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard. As she typed, the diagram in the air shifted and changed. But something wasn't quite right, the patterns were becoming more complex rather than less. You're thinking too much like a programmer, Professor O'Brien said suddenly. Remember what your grandmother used to say about music? Sometimes the notes you don't play are as important as the ones you do, Sarah quoted. She deleted several lines of code, and suddenly the pattern snapped into perfect clarity. Oh. It's not about adding more conditions to handle edge cases. It's about finding the underlying pattern that makes the edge cases impossible in the first place. Exactly, Danu said. The universe doesn't need extensive error handling if the basic laws are written correctly. That's why your patches are working, they're not just fixing the tears, they're making them less likely to occur in the first place. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, not the ominous toll of before, but something lighter, almost playful. A window popped up on Sarah's laptop, displaying a message in a font that somehow combined ASCII art with Ogham script. Copy patch 2.718281828 successfully deployed. Reality coherence improved by 0.314159%. Unexpected poetry detected in quantum foam. Side effects, minor. Increased probability of meaningful coincidences. Slight enhancement to Murphy's Law. Tea now 3.7% more likely to be exactly the right temperature. Commit message, improved metaphor handling in Copenhagen interpretation. Side effects? Sarah asked, concerned. Should we be worried about those? Reality always has side effects, Danu reassured her. The trick is to make them interesting rather than catastrophic. Speaking of which. She waved her hand, and a new window appeared in mid-air, displaying what looked like a social media feed for universal constants. Is Planck's constant posting status updates? Professor O'Brien adjusted his glasses. The constants like to stay in touch, Danu said. Helps maintain consensus reality. Oh, look, the speed of light just like your latest patch. Sarah scrolled through the feed, fascinated. Some of these constants seem to be arguing about proper boundary conditions. Should we intervene? Best not to, Danu advised. They'll sort it out themselves. Universal constants can be a bit constant in their opinions. But look here. She pointed to a notification that had just appeared. The gravitational constant is offering to beta test your next update. That's quite an honor, it usually prefers to remain conservative. A new line of code appeared on Sarah's screen, suggesting an elegant way to reconcile quantum gravity with narrative causality. The solution was breathtaking in its simplicity, 3 lines of poetry that were simultaneously valid quantum equations. That's. Sarah stared at the code. That's beautiful. But won't it change how gravity works? Only in ways that were already true but hadn't been noticed yet, Professor O'Brien said, reading over her shoulder. Like finding a better proof for a theorem that was already proven. The underlying truth doesn't change, but our understanding of it does. Danu nodded approvingly. You're both catching on faster than I expected. Ready to try something more ambitious? She gestured, and the diagram in the air expanded to show what looked like a map of Dublin. But this Dublin existed in multiple states simultaneously, the modern city overlaid with its past and potential futures, ley lines interweaving with fiber optic cables, ancient holy wells connecting to quantum probability wells. The city wants to update itself, Danu explained. It's been running on legacy code, legacy magic, for too long. But it needs to maintain backward compatibility with both history and physics. She smiled at Sarah. Think you can help it upgrade without breaking anything important? Sarah cracked her knuckles and pulled up a new code window. We'll need a staging environment for testing. And a rollback plan, just in case. The pub can serve as a staging area, Danu said. It's used to existing in multiple states anyway. As for rollback. She reached into thin air and pulled out what appeared to be an ancient leather-bound book, except its pages were made of pure quantum probability. We'll log everything here. It's a sort of version control system for reality, we used to call them grimoires. Professor O'Brien picked up his journal again. I'll document the process. Someone needs to write the paper on this, even if we have to publish it in the Journal of Irreproducible Results. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, debugging reality one quantum poetic line at a time. Above them, in the pub, Sean served drinks to tourists who never noticed that their smartphones were getting slightly better battery life due to a minor optimization in the local laws of thermodynamics. The AI surveillance system, recovering from its existential crisis, began to pick up patterns it had never noticed before. But instead of crashing, it started composing haiku about traffic flow and crowd dynamics. Its error reports became surprisingly lyrical. And somewhere in the quantum foam between possibilities, the universe itself began to learn a new way of telling its own story, one that had room for both poetry and physics, for magic and mathematics, for ancient wisdom and emerging technologies. The patches continued to deploy, each one a tiny miracle of optimization. Reality, it seemed, was finally getting the upgrade it deserved. And in the basement of a pub that existed in multiple places at once, a young woman who could write code that sang to the universe saved her latest changes and committed them to the cosmic repository. The commit message read simply, "Made reality a bit more real. And a lot more interesting." The changes rippled outward from the Wandering Hart like waves in the quantum foam. At first, they were subtle, the sort of things that people would mention in passing and then immediately forget, like how the traffic lights on O'Connell Street had developed an uncanny sense of timing, or how the flowers in St. Stephen's Green had started blooming in fractals. Sarah noticed the effects first in the university's computer science department. Her fellow graduate students' code had begun compiling on the first try, though only when they'd written it with particular elegance. The cafeteria coffee had somehow learned to adjust its temperature and caffeine content based on each student's immediate needs. And the department's ancient mainframe, which had been scheduled for replacement, suddenly started processing quantum algorithms with suspicious efficiency. "It's not just accepting the patches," she told Danu during one of their daily debugging sessions. "It's implementing its own optimizations." They were sitting in what had become their regular spot in the pub's back room, which now featured a comfortable mix of cutting-edge quantum computers and centuries-old magical artifacts. A blackboard covered in chalk dust floated nearby, displaying equations that somehow managed to be both mathematically rigorous and grammatically poetic. "Of course it is," Danu said, stirring her tea with a spoon that might have been silver or silicon or both. "That was the point. We're not just fixing reality, we're teaching it to fix itself." Professor O'Brien looked up from his journal, which had grown considerably thicker and had developed a habit of reorganizing its contents based on quantum relevance. "The scientific community is starting to notice. I've had 3 calls from CERN this morning. Their Large Hadron Collider is producing results that are simultaneously more precise and more mysterious than ever." "And the old powers?" Sarah asked. She'd learned to recognize their presence now, subtle disturbances in the probability fields, like ripples in a cosmic pond. "They're adapting better than expected," Danu said. "Though the Committee for Maintaining Metaphysical Standards is having some difficulty processing our change requests. Apparently, our latest patch violated several laws of nature that nobody had bothered to update since the Bronze Age." Sarah's laptop chimed, a sound that had become familiar throughout Dublin's tech community, as it tended to precede moments of unexpected breakthrough. A new notification appeared. "Copy patch 3.14159265 ready for review. Changes proposed. Implemented quantum entanglement optimization for public transport. Added poetic exception handling for probability cascades. Updated metaphysical API to support modern authentication protocols. Deprecated outdated cosmic constants, with backward compatibility layer. Note, requires approval from both scientific peer review and Bardic Council." "The Bardic Council?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know they were still active." "Oh yes," Danu smiled. "Though these days they mostly meet on Discord. Much more efficient than the old stone circles, though some of the older members still complain about the lack of proper moonlight." Professor O'Brien peered at the notification. "These changes, they're not just affecting Dublin anymore, are they?" "Reality," Danu reminded him, "doesn't much care for geographical boundaries. Or any other kind, for that matter. Once you start optimizing the underlying patterns." She was interrupted by a sound like 1,000 libraries shuffling their contents. The air shimmered, and a figure stepped through, a woman wearing what appeared to be a combination of a lab coat and ceremonial robes, with a tablet computer in one hand and a staff of office in the other. "Representative Chen," Danu said, rising. "The International Association of Theoretical Thaumaturgy honors us with its presence. We could hardly ignore what's happening here," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying harmonics of both peer-reviewed authority and ancient wisdom. "Do you have any idea how many paradigms you're shifting? The Quantum Mechanics Department is filing joint research papers with the Department of Comparative Mythology. We've had to create entirely new peer review protocols just to handle the submissions. Is that a problem? Sarah asked, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. A problem? Dr. Chen laughed. It's revolutionary. We're seeing similar effects worldwide. The Bangalore Institute of Technology reported their AI systems have started collaborating with local temple priests. CERN's physicists are consulting with Aboriginal Dreamtime experts. The binary between scientific and mystical understanding is dissolving, and in its place. She gestured at Sarah's laptop. In its place, we're finding something new. Something better. But? Danu prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But we need structure. Guidelines. Some way to ensure these changes don't spiral out of control. Dr. Chen placed her tablet on the table. That's why I'm here. The association is proposing the establishment of a new division, the Department of Quantum Poetic Standards and Practices. Sarah's laptop chimed again, displaying a new message. Copy incoming priority update. Reality Framework version 4.0 proposed. Major changes. Unified theory of everything, now including literary criticism. Quantum Poetic License, GPL compatible. Universal Constants Code of Conduct. Cross-platform compatibility between scientific method and magical praxis. Warning, will require full regression testing across multiple dimensions. They want me to help write the standards, don't they? Sarah asked, already seeing where this was going. Not just you, Dr. Chen said. We're assembling a team. Scientists, mages, programmers, poets, philosophers, anyone who can help bridge the gaps between different ways of understanding reality. She smiled. Though I must admit, your commit messages have already become required reading in several universities. Professor O'Brien picked up his journal. I assume you'll want documentation. Extensive documentation, Dr. Chen agreed. In multiple formats, accessible to both peer review and ritual circle. Danu had been unusually quiet, studying Dr. Chen with ancient eyes. Finally, she spoke. The old powers agreed to this? They didn't just agree, Dr. Chen said. They insisted. Something about preferring managed change to chaos. Though I suspect it helps that your patches have made their jobs easier. Apparently, maintaining the fabric of reality is much less stressful when it can handle most routine maintenance automatically. Sarah was already reviewing the proposed standards, her code adapting and evolving as she read. This could work, she said slowly. But we'll need to maintain flexibility. Reality doesn't take kindly to being too rigidly defined. That, Dr. Chen said, is exactly why we need people like you on the team. People who understand both the logic and the poetry of how the universe works. She turned to Danu. With your permission, of course. She is your apprentice. Oh, I think Sarah's proven she's ready to teach as well as learn, Danu said proudly. Besides, someone needs to help reality debug itself. She grinned. Though I expect I'll still be needed for code reviews. Outside the Wandering Hart, Dublin continued to evolve, its streets and stones learning to sing in harmony with its fiber optics and wireless signals. The AI surveillance system had started a poetry club with several local ghosts. And in universities and sacred sites around the world, people were beginning to remember that there had never really been a difference between science and magic, just different ways of reading the universe's source code. Sarah saved her latest changes and closed her laptop. Well, she said, I suppose we should get started on those standards. Reality isn't going to document itself. Actually, Danu said with a mysterious smile, you might be surprised. Check your last commit. Sarah opened her laptop again and burst out laughing. There, in the commit history, was a message she hadn't written.